2:07 p.m., September 29th, 2008. Who remembers where they were? Anybody? When I called my friend Sarah, my neighbor, and conveniently an expert on Congress, which had at that exact moment torpedoed George W. Bush's TARP bill. Markets were in disarray. The economy was in disarray. The Fed had supported this major legislative effort, and for sure we can say that Congress was in disarray. So never letting a crisis go to waste. I still don't think Sarah and I could have known that that conversation at really the end of the summer in 2008 would lead to this. We're grateful to Jeff and the Price and Marshall schools for their interest in our work. And really, what better way to connect thoughts about public policy and financial economics than talking about the political history of the Federal Reserve? And finally, just before I kick off what we mean by the myth, I'd like to thank Sarah. Ours is a unique collaboration, academic and practitioner, but we argue necessary for explaining how politics constrains the Fed's conduct of monetary policy. To be sure, the protagonists in our story influence markets and the economy and are influenced by them. We hope our collaboration can shed some new light on how Congress governs the Fed. Everyone wants to know, why did we write the book? As I hinted, in the heat of the recent financial crisis, 10 years ago, but it often feels like yesterday, we realized that the history of monetary politics had not been explored. Or maybe more accurately, more academically, it hadn't been integrated. And in trying to understand market behavior and political behavior, we wanted to think about these two fundamental questions and come at it from a practitioner and a political science perspective. A question really, why did it take us, and has it really taken us 100 years to solve the panic of 1907? And how do we account for the Fed's transformation over that century? Critically and contemporarily, what role do politics and economics play in continuing to shape the relationship between the Fed and its boss? Just a quick overview, and I just want to keep these, ask you to keep these terms in mind, but we see this time and time again, this assumption of independence. It colors every bit of analysis, reporting, and scholarship of the Federal Reserve. And we want to introduce a slightly but important new notion of interdependence, and just ask you to keep that in mind during this talk and going forward. We're going to explore that, and we're going to look at the evidence of the ways that these two institutions have influenced one another, the Fed's impact on Congress and the impact of politics on the Fed. Just a brief history of American U.S. central banking. First Bank of the United States, congressionally chartered for 20 years, brainchild of that Broadway star Alexander Hamilton, ultimately mothballed in 1811 by Jefferson, more accurately his Vice President Clinton. Second Bank of the United States, essentially reconstituted the first bank 5 years later, another 20-year charter. The election of 1832, you all remember hard money populist Clay versus Jackson. Jackson kills the Second Bank of the United States. Just saying he's our current president's ideological touchstone. Third Bank of the United States, this 3BUS is slightly different. I think what's in a name, the Federal Reserve, the nature of that federalism has been important, but these central banks aren't constitutional. They are creatures of Congress operating in its political sphere, and two have disappeared. Again, just saying. Finally, the myth of independence. Our title gives it away. Conventional wisdom endorses a deeply entrenched notion of Fed independence. Generally, people assume that the Fed is an independent central bank within the government. Congress creates the Fed, sets its goals, insulating itself from inflationary temptation. People assume the Fed has instrument independence to do what it wants with interest rates and the balance sheet. And while you'd never know it from the recent Fed chair sweepstakes, structural features, extraordinary long terms of governors, staggered tenure for the chair, a very weird public-private partnership, again, that federal nature of the institution, are all there supposedly to ensure some autonomy. These are common claims made by central bankers and members of Congress. We find the conventional wisdom frozen in time, especially considering the Fed's focus has more often been one of fighting disinflation, lowflation, outright deflation. Again, thinking about the recent financial crisis. And it's altogether a much more complicated and different kind of crisis. And as we'll show quickly, Congress has an enormous influence on the shape and contours of monetary policy. And so we tag the two bodies as interdependent institutions. So what makes Congress and the Fed interdependent institutions? Take the Fed's perspective first. When asked, the Fed is clear that Congress is our boss. This is precisely what Ben Bernanke said when a reporter asked him if he had any advice for the then incoming Fed chair, Janet Yellen. Why? Because Congress always retains the power to reopen and revise the governing law, the Federal Reserve Act, and has periodically, if not often, used it to revise the powers and governance of the Fed. Why is that important? We try to show that the Fed's power is therefore contingent on securing political support, and that political support from Congress is contingent on the Fed's stewardship of the economy. Right off the bat, that raises questions about Fed independence. If Fed's autonomy is conditional on support from Congress, we ask, what type of independence is that? Now take Congress's perspective. Congress clearly depends on the Fed. Why? They need a body of experts to steer the economy. 535 people have a hard enough time raising revenue and spending it, but it's a lot more than that. Members of Congress are motivated both by making good policy and proximately getting reelected. And that means that Congress needs someone to blame when the economy sours. Who better than the almighty Fed? Certainly the economy needs a healthy mix of monetary policy from the Fed and fiscal policy from Congress, another element of their interdependence. And Congress empowers the Fed as an ultimate financial regulator. The point is that interdependence extends far beyond just monetary policy. I'm going to pass the podium over to Sarah to look a little closer into this political history, and then we'll come back and examine a series of waypoints along the 100-year history of how Congress governs the Federal Reserve. I should add that in writing The Myth of Independence, and like the federal government, we accrued a lot of debts along the way. I am also told that what a writer needs is stability and constancy during the inevitable ups and downs of the writing process, even as the book swells to absorb more and more space, physical and emotional. It was a 10-year project. And a book is like a guest in the house who arrives one day settling in, increasingly demanding and ill-tempered, with no sign of imminent departure. It takes a very gracious host to find room for such a guest, even while gently moving him day by day closer to the exit. Sarah has been that gracious host. She invited me, a practitioner, to collaborate on this project that I knew would stretch me more than anything I had previously done. And it is only because of her that we have been able to bring this project to a conclusion. So to her, I owe the biggest debt.
The question then for us is, why should we care so much about interdependence? And we argue that interdependence gives rise to a cycle of what we call a crisis, blame, and then reform, and then, as we'll talk about, empowerment of the Fed. So the idea here is that this crisis not only gives rise to the origins of the Fed, but as we trace through the book, repeated crisis is followed by efforts to blame the Fed and then to reopen the act to reconsider the powers of the Fed that then drives the institutional development of the Fed over its 100-year history. So crisis, we mean financial crisis or economic crisis. We get the response of lawmakers to blame the Fed, to deflect blame from members, to deflect it back to the Fed, and then often to reopen the act to reconsider the powers of the Fed in the wake of crisis. Oftentimes, and most typically, Congress gives the Fed more power, even though the Fed has often just failed in its mission, in its performance of running the economy. Sometimes Congress clips the wings of the Fed, right, to take away some of the powers, in essence as punishment and blame for the Fed. Increasingly, since the 1970s, part of these reforms require imposing more transparency onto the Fed, and sometimes all of the above. So Exhibit A here would be the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, right? The Fed was made, even though the Fed was blamed for the onset of crisis, at least partially blamed for the onset of crisis, Congress made the Fed the sort of uber systematic regulator of large financial institutions. That is, it gave it more responsibility even after it failed. Congress clipped what we call 13(3) emergency lending powers, sort of the lender of last resort, sort of the key power of a central bank. They clipped the ways it could be used in the future. Congress imposed more transparency on the Fed and how its emergency loans and to whom the loans would be given and how it would be disclosed. But our point here is that we see this not just in Dodd-Frank, but we see this type of cycle occur over the history of the Fed. So this will be a very long list that you can't see. Don't worry about it, but we're going to come back to some of these episodes. But the point is, it's not just Fed. It recurs from 1913, the creation of the Fed, through 2015, the last time there was a change in the Fed. But it gives rise to the question for us in the book. If we're correct here about the cycle, blame, crisis, blame, and reform, what should we expect to see over the course of the Fed's history and its interactions with Congress? So what I'm going to do is just talk about some of what we think of as these observable implications of the cycle. I'm going to run through 3 of them, and then we'll switch gears and talk a little bit about not just Congress's impact on the Fed's impact on Congress, but vice versa. So the first observable implication here has to do with the relationship of the public and the Fed. So what we do here is we want to have evidence and look for evidence that the public blames the Fed for economic downturns. We're looking for evidence that the public holds the Fed accountable for the state of the economy. Do citizens know whom to blame in the wake of a crisis? So what we do is we gather all survey questions that have been asked. Here we take from 1979 through Janet Yellen 2014. Some of these questions ask to give the name. What do you think of Greenspan's performance? What do you think of Volcker? What do you think of Yellen? Other times these questions ask, do you approve of the way the Fed is handling interest rates? Sometimes it just asks about the Fed as an institution. All of those we combine together, and essentially we take those approval ratings and regress them on the state of the economy, unemployment, inflation, and a couple other factors there. But what the graph then shows is predicted approval as a function of the unemployment rate. And it's subtle here, but it clearly shows that the worse the economy, that the Fed's public standing takes a hit. So the public is well aware, obviously, of economic prosperity and economic downturns, but they know whom to blame in the wake of crisis. In other words, there is some evidence here, right, that either Congress is succeeding here in casting blame on the Fed and the public picking up on that. Of course, it's also possible it's the other way around, right? The public knows whom to blame, and Congress amplifies that by piling on and blaming the Fed as well. But that strikes us as sort of the first part of the cycle of the crisis and then blame, right? Members clearly have an electoral incentive to blame the Fed because they know the public is picking up on casting out blame onto the Fed. The next observable implication asks then, well, what should we expect to see from members' behavior in the wake of economic downturns? And as I'll explain here, what we find is that congressional attention to the Fed rises when the economy turns down, and we see more threats issued against the Fed in the form of proposed legislation. So what we do is we grab all bills introduced since 1947 that in some way affect the Federal Reserve. We code the sponsor, so who's suggesting the bills, who's threatening the Fed, the direction, is it empowering the Fed, is it constraining the Fed, requiring more transparency, and so forth. And then we plot all these, in this case, we're just counting the sheer number of bills plotted against the misery index, so the sum of inflation, the inflation rate, and the unemployment rate. And when you dig below the data in the chart here and model the underlying relationship then between the state of the economy and congressional threats, it's pretty clear that there's a reactive, in fact, counter-cyclical Congress. So when the economy is doing fine, there's no incentive for Congress to pile onto the Fed, let alone pay any attention to the Fed, right? Congress just takes the credit for a good economy and leaves the Fed alone. But as unemployment rises, and when you model the data here, inflation really doesn't have much of an effect. But it's unemployment, people out of work, that seems to instigate and drive members to introduce more bills. So as unemployment rises, more people out of work, legislators blame the Fed and threaten to open up the act to reform the Federal Reserve Act. That strikes us as classic blame-avoiding behavior. Bad economic times, lawmakers try to deflect blame back to the Fed. Now, just to give you, and this is mostly just to give you a sense of what's behind the data and the number of bills, we've pulled out all of the Audit the Fed bills, which today we associate with Senator Rand Paul, as well as former Representative Ron Paul, right? But the point here is just to be clear that the lineage, that there's a political history to the Audit the Fed proposals. So they are right here by the sponsor from mid-50s through 2014. And then they're aligned here by their ideology using nominate scores here. So the lower you are, the more liberal, the higher you are, more conservative. So just to keep in mind, right, today we think, well, perhaps we're in this new period where the far right wants to gang up on the Fed and to impose more transparency, the ultimate transparency in the form of an audit, right? So that we know how the decisions are being made around the board table when they're setting interest rates. But keep in mind, these threats have a long history, and in fact are started by a left side populist, right, Patman, in the 1950s. And for a period here, centrists, Mathis, Lee Hamilton, my favorite, centrists are the ones imposing and threatening to impose audits. And today, if we take out the columns in the middle here, essentially we've got the far right and the far left of both wings, the wings of both parties attacking the Fed. Okay, so we're two observable implications in. One, that the public knows whom to blame in the wake of financial and economic downturns. Second, that Congress is countercyclical and reacts in the wake of economic downturns. But we also want to see evidence here that Congress actually opens up the act, right? Not just issues threats by introducing bills, but we want to be able to see that when the economy turns down, Congress, in fact, is more likely to threaten and to go through the work of opening up the Federal Reserve Act. So what we do then from that long list I showed you before, we have the history of key episodes of reform of the Federal Reserve Act. We then can, over a 100-year period, we just basically run a model predicting what's the likelihood in any given year that there's reform of the Fed as a function of the state of the economy and a number of political variables. So the duration of a recession, if there's a recession going on, the severity of a recession. We control for unemployment rate, we control for inflation, whether or not it's unified party control or divided control, expecting more likelihood of action on a unified party control. And then we also try to see, whether there's some partisan behavior going on here. Are you more likely to open up and reform the Fed if the president from the other party, from the congressional majority, has appointed the chair of the Fed? No matter how we code that and run that, we really don't find any evidence of that cross-party attacking of the Fed for reasons we can come back to. But what we hear when we simulate the likelihood of reform, as unemployment rises, the likelihood of reform goes up, much higher in periods of unified party control. And just to be clear here, 25%, luckily we've just had that, right? That's the Great Depression. That only comes, we hope, only once. Okay, so that, you might say, well, that's sort of the empirical evidence here. What does the Fed think about that? And what we pull out, this was the 50th anniversary birthday party for the Fed. There was congressional testimony, and the chair of the Fed, McChesney Martin, who'd been there about to be there a very long time, he basically encapsulates this argument about blame and the role of the Fed. As he said, you are in the position of being able to blame us if things go wrong. We're not asking for applause if things go right, and so forth. But I think we will bear the opprobrium of the people if things go wrong, and we have to. This is our responsibility. right? He's recognizing we are both the punching bag, right? And Congress expects us to be that punching bag, and we know that that is the role that we've been created in part to play. Okay, so that's to give you a sense of the evidence of the ways in which the Fed and the shape of the economy shape congressional behavior, right? The other direction is a little harder, right, to show the impact of politics and congressional politics on the choice and the design of monetary policy, right? Because the counterfactual is a little hard here. Right? We don't have a counterfactual Fed against which we can look, take away the political pressures and see what monetary policy would have been. So what we're going to do is pull out one historical case and then one contemporary case. One is about Volcker in the 1980s, and the second one will be about Bernanke and the adoption of what is known as the inflation target. Of course, that Volcker is the one who we say slayed, the Volcker Fed slayed stagflation after it had been rising in the late 70s. We know that Volcker came in, he's appointed in late 79. Interest rates, he jacks them up here to 20%. Right? Think about interest rates today. We've just come off the zero bound. Just remember what the 80s would be like. It stays up there for a while until it very gradually then comes down, right, to 10%. And Congress, of course, is watching. They don't like what they're seeing, at least publicly. Audit the Fed gets proposed, impeach the Fed chair, end the Fed, right? That's not just Ron Paul. Actually, that might have been the first version. That's probably Ron Paul in the 80s, and so forth. Limit interest rates. There were votes on limiting interest rates, and so forth. Okay, but the question really here is, how did Volcker succeed in slaying stagflation in the early 80s after Arthur Burns, this celebrated economist as Fed chair, had failed so miserably in the 1970s, right, to create these high rates of inflation and unemployment? Well, conventional wisdom is this is independence, right? That the reason Volcker was able to do that is because politicians had their hands behind their back, right? That's the classic account of central bank independence. We need a Fed that is insulated from politics in order to prescribe tough medicine, right? Interest rates up to 20%. The alternative is our account of interdependence. And we argue in the book, and I'm just going to give you a small snippet of it here, that political support for the Fed empowered Volcker to raise rates and to bring on a recession. Right? So we're not arguing that it's just politics, right? But we are arguing that part of what made possible the onset and then the timing of curtailing the anti-inflation campaign was due to Fed officials' perceptions and acknowledgement of the extent to which they had political support from the administration, from the Reagan administration, from a Republican Senate, and elsewhere in Congress. So what we do is we use, in this part of the book, we use the Federal Open Market Committee transcripts. So the transcripts verbatim of what was being said around the table at each of the meetings. Now, today, everybody knows that there are, and Fed officials know, there are transcripts, and they get released. There's a 5-year lag. In the late 70s and into the early 80s, Fed officials, as best we understand, did not know that there were recorded verbatim transcripts being saved. They knew they were being recorded because they were used to make minutes, but they were under the impression that they were being recorded over. Lucky for us, it gives a window because they're talking about a lot of stuff around the table, talking about political costs and the political benefits and the political support that they have. Now, just one quick thing when you think about the current, now that everybody knows the transcripts are available, they're still talking about political costs and political risk. But in this period here where there seems to be no understanding that this could come back to haunt them, that we know what they were doing, it seems quite revealing to us. So again, just snippets here of what we're finding here. Volcker, 79, when he's about to start. I have also told you that the administration is ready for a strong program. He's making the case it's time to get going. Volcker, 1980, we have political support and understanding for what we have been doing, trying to reassure the committee, despite these high rates, that this is the right thing to be doing. 1981, Guffey, one of the Reserve Bank presidents, for the first time ever, we do have, for whatever length of time, the support of the administration at least. He's just said, look, in the past we've kind of walked up to the hitching post and then we've got scared and we've backed off, right? Which somewhat explains what was going on in the 1970s. 1981, Roos, another Reserve Bank president, we have to think of our vulnerability from a public opinion point of view if the economy remains soft. And Volcker, 1981, I think the public patience for climbing up the hill, meaning hiking, going for a rate hike, okay, very rapidly again, may be extremely limited, right? Some members around the table think it's time they need a lot of political pressure and it's time to withdraw the rate hikes. And he says, look, can't do that because we won't have political support to go back up the hill again. Finally, 82, Volcker, when we're winding down. If we get this one wrong, the timing-wise, we are going to have legislation next year without a doubt. Right? So Fed officials understand the importance, I think, we show in the book, of political support and seem to have very finely tuned political antennae, worried about when that support might disappear. Okay. Those are the sort of historical example of the historical episodes there. Mark's going to finish us off on contemporary.
As Sarah said, and I found it very hard in the research for the book to get my head around the absence of counterfactuals. But what we've tried to do, Sarah, in sort of talking about the Volcker episode in the very late 70s and 80s, sort of touch on what we can find primary source material. The sort of contemporary example that we think is iconic is the debate around the inflation target. And what we wanted to see was whether there was whether there was evidence that legislative action or threats can check the power and independence of the Federal Reserve in terms of setting and establishing, if not, or changing an inflation target. And we do touch on many in the book, as Sarah said, but I think focusing on this is really the most current contemporary example that we think sort of goes quite closely to this myth, this interdependence. And as Sarah said, exploring what the Fed might have done in the absence of congressional threats or action is very hard to find and prove. But we think, and judging by the reactions that we've heard from legislators and central bankers, we think we hit pretty close to the mark. Economic theory tells us that central bankers have the autonomy to choose monetary tools, as I said, to decide the level of interest rates, the size of the balance sheet, and so forth. But that theory doesn't square very well with the Fed's efforts to adopt an inflation target, a tool used by many central banks and central bankers around the world. And really sort of very brief idea is that by setting a numeric target for inflation, this helps the public really set its own expectations about future monetary policy, about consumer prices, inflation, and the level of rates. Sort of tends to anchor those assumptions. Bernanke, now the old chair of the Fed, starts advocating for an inflation target when he joins the board in 2002. But there's a political problem. The Fed has this dual mandate of trying to control inflation and establish full employment, and that an inflation target would only establish a goal or a target for half of that mandate. He's also the most widely acclaimed academic associated with inflation targeting. He had written a book about inflation targeting, and he believed very much that in the theory of central banking, you needed to have that kind of anchor. But he also knew that in order to put this in place, he would need congressional approval. And we see this in transcripts from FOMC debates before the crisis and after. And here, for example, is Don Cohn, the vice chair of the Fed, when Bernanke was chair. He said in December 2008, quote, "Having an inflation target won't have any effect if it is repudiated by the Congress," end quote. As Sarah said, these transcripts come out with a 5-year lag. The most recent for 2012 quoted Janet Yellen, the former chair, telling the committee that they'd worked on it for decades, sort of a long period of time to put this in place. And in his memoir, Bernanke initially approached Barney Frank about scaffolding this target. Barney Frank, as many of you know, was the very powerful chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. He pushed back, arguing that emphasizing one side of the inflation-employment duality, especially during a recession, was basically a non-starter. Bernanke kept pushing, and ultimately it took him 10 years from that initial 2002 entry to the central bank to convince his boss. Sensitive to that pushback, the target therefore needed this explicit permission from Congress to be put in place. We raise this example because quite recently there's been a lot of talk amongst the Federal Open Market Committee, the policy setting committee for the Fed, about raising the target. Keep in mind inflation has been quite low for some time, just during and after the crisis. We've heard from the San Francisco Fed President John Williams, a candidate we hear for the number 2 spot in Washington, from Boston Fed President Rosengren, from former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve and the central banker Stan Fisher, Ben Bernanke, more recently since he's left the board. They've all been talking about the virtues of raising the target. But we wanted to see what the boss had to say, and so this was from the end of summer last year, 2017, the former chair of the Fed, Janet Yellen, testifying before the House Financial Services Committee, the chair of which is Jeb Hanserling.
In a recent press conference, some interpreted comments that you made to indicate that you were open to an increase in the inflation target. Are you pursuing an increase in the inflation target? Are other members of the FOMC, is this a matter of discussion within the FOMC to increase the 2% inflation target?
It is not. We reaffirmed our 2% inflation target in January. We are very focused on trying to achieve our 2% inflation target, and it is not a subject of discussion.
This, we think, is the most recent, but really a very good example of what interdependence looks like. When there are calls for the Fed, and in this case, by the Fed, to increase the target, at this point, Republicans in Congress push back hard against any change. Don't do anything without talking to us. Fed claims that it has independence, particularly for setting monetary policy. But it is, as Sarah and I have shown just this afternoon, acutely sensitive to the need to secure political support for their policy choices. And just on this contemporary example, one might ask what a higher inflation target would accomplish in an environment where the Fed has failed to hit its 2% inflation goal. And we'd probably not be having a long-running debate about whether they should be raising rates and normalizing interest rate policy if the target were higher. So we write in the book that so long as lawmakers remain risk-averse re-election seekers, blame game dynamics will shape the Federal Reserve. Ultimately, Congress's counter-cyclical focus endows the Fed with some autonomy when the economy is strong, but hems it in when the economy falters. At best, the Federal Reserve earns partial and contingent independence from Congress, and thus we conclude barely any independence at all. Thank you.